This is Mrs. Palmer Quay, and this is video 6.2. In this video, we will be talking about the muscles that are involved in movement, what we call those different types of movements, and which particular muscles you have to memorize for this unit. I just want to start by reminding you that skeletal muscles, which are the focus of this particular section of the curriculum, but they are important for generating body movements along with maintaining posture and being involved in thermoregulation and generating heat. And that the action of each muscle, the type of movement that it does give you, depends on what kind of joint it is associated with. And we've already spent some time talking about the different kinds of joints. And then the way the muscle is attached, because muscle cells are contractile cells and they need to have something to pull against in order to have movement. So attachments are very important. There are several types of contractions. We divide these into two groups. There are isotonic contractions and isometric contractions. In isotonic contractions, you see a change in the muscle length when the muscle contracts. And actually, it can shorten or it can lengthen. So in this first example, the muscle is shortening with a force that is greater than the weight of this little dumbbell that the figure is lifting, and so the movement is in the same direction as the contraction, so the muscle shortens as it works. In the next diagram, you see that the movement is descending, so the force of the contraction is lesser than the weight of the dumbbell. It's a controlled fall. So this muscle is contracting, but the muscle is lengthening at the same time because it's not contracting enough to pick up that weight. The third category here, the third picture, is the isometric contraction. And in this case, your muscle is contracting, but there is no change in length. And so this still, you have a neural stimulation to the muscle, but it's not getting smaller, it's not lengthening, it's just staying stable in one place, as if someone is pulling on an object that's so heavy they can't move it at all, or if you're standing in a doorway pushing up against the wall. There are a number of isometric contractions that people sometimes do for exercise. Body movement is based on the action of levers. Getting a little bit of physics in here. There are 4 parts to a lever. There is some type of rigid bar that connects the next 3 parts together. And in our body, bones serve as that rigid bar. There is a fulcrum or a pivot point at which the movement happens, and so in our body it's our joints that provide that pivot point. There is something providing resistance or load, and so when it comes to our own body, it's the weight of whatever part of the body that's being moved or what is being held if we're doing something with our hands that's providing resistance or load to the movement. And then, of course, most importantly for this unit, there is the force that's supplying the energy for the movement, which are our muscles. We further categorize levers into 3 classes based on the arrangement of the fulcrum and the resistance and the force. So a first class lever has the fulcrum in the middle, and so scissors are a prime example of that. There are not a lot of first class levers in the body. Probably the easiest one to visualize is what happens when you nod your head. The pivot point for nodding your head is the joint between your skull and the first cervical vertebrae, and you have the weight of your head being the resistance or load and various muscles that are providing the force to move it back and forth. In a second class lever, the fulcrum is at the very end and the force is at the other end. And about the only example in the human body of this situation is standing on your toes. The joints down there on your metatarsals are the pivot point, and the force is provided by the muscles of your calf, and you've got your whole body weight basically balanced on the arch of your foot when you're standing on your toes. Most of the lever setups in the body are these third class levers, where you have the pivot point again at one end, and then the force is in the middle. And the advantage to this particular type of lever is that a very small movement here with the force leads to a much bigger movement down here at the end where the resistance or the load is. And so the overall effect is that you have a greater increase in speed with muscle contraction. Now that I've taken care of that phone call, let's move on. To look at the third class lever a little more specifically with the movement of the arm, we have these two diagrams. And in this first diagram, we see the biceps brachii, the biceps muscle providing the force of contraction, and it is concentric. It is getting smaller as it contracts, and the movement then is moving the weight this way along the same direction as the contraction. And the pivot point is your elbow, so there's your fulcrum. As I said, in a third class lever, it goes fulcrum and then force and then the resistance. And so you can see that the attachment site here for your biceps muscle is on the radius. And so it ends up being in between the fulcrum and the load, which is the definition of a third class lever. And as I said, a small movement here for your biceps ends up in a large movement down at the end of your arm, a much faster response. When you want to lower the muscle here, we're going to use this little diagram has got a pulley system. So the movement then is we're going in the opposite direction than the muscle contraction. This is the triceps muscle that's going to be involved in lowering a load. But again, your muscle attachment, you can't really see it because it's on the other side of the elbow, but it's attached down here on the ulna. So again, you still have fulcrum and force and resistance in the same order. The contraction of the triceps in the second example is also a concentric contraction because even though the arm is lowering, it is your triceps muscle back here that is working, and it is contracting as the arm lowers. When we're talking about muscles, we will talk about where they are, the origin and the insertion, the two places where they are attached. And so, of course, for any kind of movement to happen, the muscle has to go across at least one joint. This example here, again, of your biceps shows that the origin is attached here on the scapula, and the attachment is down here, the insertion down here is on the radius. And it's moving across then the joint of the elbow, allowing movement to happen. You do not have to memorize origin and insertion points for the muscles that you need to know for this unit, but sometimes it helps to have look that up as you're learning the muscles to just try to get the movement in your head. The skeletal muscles are assigned different roles based on what they're doing in a particular movement. So one muscle will be known as the prime mover, or the agonist, the one that's responsible for that movement. But muscles don't work all by themselves. There are other muscles that are in a supporting role. They're supporting the joints. They're keeping unnecessary movement from happening. And so they are known as the synergists in that particular movement. And then there is usually an antagonist, a muscle that has an action to cause movement in the opposite direction. And so in the case of your arm, of course, just to draw a little arm here, you've got your biceps on one side and your triceps on the other. And so these are antagonistic muscles. They work in opposite directions. When your biceps is contracting, the triceps needs to be relaxing or no movement is going to happen. And one of the things that happens for people that are in a spastic condition is that their muscles are, both antagonistic muscles are contracting, and so movement is not possible at all. The role of any particular muscle will depend on the particular movement. And as we go through the muscles that you need to know, you'll see sometimes that they have they're responsible for more than one movement, and in each of those movements they may be acting as an antagonist to another muscle or be the prime mover, or in movements that we aren't talking about, they're acting mainly in a supporting role as a synergistic muscle. So as the joints go through these various types of movements, as they're pulled around by muscles, we have specific names for them, and I just gave you the whole list here, but we're going to go through them more specifically with pictures. So if you think of 180 degrees sort of being the central point, so if I draw an axis down through this person here at 180 degrees, movement away from that 180 degrees to make it smaller is flexion. Movement back towards that 180 degrees is extension, and movement beyond 180 degrees is hyperextension. Some of our joints are made to perform hyperextension, the vertebral column being one, our wrist joint being another. Other joints in somebody who has loose ligaments may have a little bit of hyperextension in their elbow or their knee, but many joints are not designed to extend beyond the 180-degree line. When you're talking about your foot in particular, this flexion this way is dorsiflexion. And then when you're flexing the other way so that the bottom of your foot is curling, you have plantar flexion. When you're talking about your hand and turning your hand palm up or palm down, you are either experiencing protonation, this particular slide kept letters on it, or supination. And the way to remember that if your hand is in the supine position, you could hold a bowl of soup in the middle. So supination is palm up. This slide lost its arrows in the translation. But if a limb, primarily we're talking about limbs, is moving away from the body, it is abduction. Just like if somebody, a person is abducted by a kidnapper, they are being taken away from their home. So abduction moves away, and then adduction, so ab with a B or add with a D, adduction is bringing the limb back towards the center line of the body. When the very end of a limb moves around in a circle, you have circumduction. This primarily concerns your hands or your feet. When you have part of the body turning around a central axis, like when you turn your head, you have rotation. And we also can talk about your limbs rotating. They can rotate laterally out from the center line, if we think about extending this axis, or medially, a medial rotation back in towards the center. Another specific movement for the feet concerns turning the feet. Turning them inward towards that medial line is inversion, and turning them outwardly laterally is eversion. Moving a part of the body forward, as you can do with your jaw, is protraction, and then returning it, or actually going past the normal point here, would be called retraction. And finally, other parts of your body, such as your jaw or your shoulders, can be elevated, going up, or depressed, brought back down again. So now let's get into looking at some of these specific skeletal muscles that you need to memorize. There are 30 muscles that I want you to know, not only where they are on a diagram, but also at least one movement that they accomplish for us in our bodies. In general, muscle names give us some clues as to some things about them. It may tell us the size or the shape, location, the action the muscle does, where it's attached, how its fibers are arranged. So I have some examples down here at the bottom. Pectoralis major. Well, pectoralis tells you it's somewhere connected to the pectoral girdle up there on your shoulders, and major tells you it's a big muscle as opposed to minor, a smaller muscle. Deltoid gives you an indication of its shape. It is a triangular shape, such as the Greek letter delta. Extensor digitorum, it extends your digits, so that tells you what it does, its actions. Biceps brachii tells you that there are two heads to this muscle, bi meaning two, sep being a shortened form of cephala, and brachii referring to the arm. I see a spelling mistake I didn't catch. This should be an L here, not an H. But the sternocleidomastoid muscle is telling you that it goes from your sternum to your clavicle to the mastoid process, and we're going to see that one in a minute. And then external obliques are muscles that are to the outside. They're external, and their muscle fibers run in a slant, in an oblique direction. So let's start now with some muscles that are involved in facial expression and mastication, which just means chewing your food. The slides I borrowed from another slide presentation, and so they include more muscles than you need to remember. I've underlined them, the ones that you need to take note of, I've underlined them in blue. So starting here at the top, a muscle that is involved in having you raise your eyebrows is the frontalis muscle. Sometimes it's grouped together with the occipitus muscle in the back of your head to form the epicranius muscle. And of course, we'd already talked about the epicranial aponeurosis connecting this particular muscle across the top of your head. So the frontalis muscle raises your eyebrows. You have two circular muscles on your face. Those are orbicularis muscles, the orbicularis oculi and the orbicularis oris. The orbicularis oculi, being around your eye, is involved in blinking and squinting. The orbicularis oris around your mouth is what enables you to pucker up for a kiss. If you want to smile, you need to use your zygomaticus muscle, and it actually has two strands, a major and a minor version, but all you need to know is zygomaticus. When it comes to chewing, I want you to know two muscles, the masseter muscle here, which we see on this particular diagram, this big muscle that you can feel when you chew, and then the temporalis muscle, which you also can feel when you chew. You can feel yourself chewing up here, but I just use this cutaway version because you get a better sense of the insertion of that muscle. And then finally, I mentioned the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which you can feel along the side of your neck. This is this big, long muscle that is involved in turning your head or bending your head from side to side. Moving on to the muscles that are going to move your pectoral girdle and your arm. The trapezius muscle up here, you can feel it on the top of your shoulder, is involved in moving your scapula, your shoulder blade. It, of course, you can logically think that it's going to be involved in elevating your scapula. The rhomboid or rhomboidal muscle over here, rhomboideus, comes in again a major and a minor form, bigger and a smaller version, and since it is below the scapula, I think you can figure out that this is involved in then depressing the scapula. So the trapezius and the rhomboid muscles work as antagonists in moving your shoulder blade around and stabilizing the pectoral girdle. Your deltoid muscle, again one that is often easily seen on someone who's been doing some bodybuilding, is involved in adducting your arm, pulling your arm away from the body. It also extends the arm, brings it to 180 degrees, and moves the arm in several directions. Can be involved in flexion too, depending upon your point of perspective. The latissimus dorsi muscle, which is going along the back of your ribs and again attaching down on your humerus, so it is involved in adducting your arm, bringing it back to the body. So the deltoid and the latissimus dorsi muscles again are antagonistic. These diagrams down below just separated them out a little bit more so that you can see where the origin and attachment points are. As I said, this is just for your own information. You don't need to memorize them. Another muscle of the arm that you are responsible for knowing is the triceps. And so triceps, of course, is referring to the fact that there are three heads. There are three origin points, which you can just sort of see here. They're on the head of the humerus. But the triceps brachii is responsible for extension of your forearm across the elbow joint. It's found on the back of your arm, so this, of course, is the posterior view. The various other muscles you don't have to be so concerned with. Moving to an anterior view, of course, the biceps brachii muscle is one I think you're probably very familiar with. The fact that it has two heads, again, here it is attaching on the anterior side of the head of the humerus. And so this muscle then provides flexion of across the elbow, bringing the forearm up towards the shoulder. You can see some of the other muscles we've already talked about, the trapezius muscle, the deltoid muscle, on this drawing as well. You do not need to know any of the muscles that move the hand. I included this slide just to show you that down in the hand and your fingers themselves, you don't have any muscles. But these long tendons connecting to muscles in the forearm are what enable you to move your fingers in so many delicate movements. And if you look at these names, again, these are names that give you an idea of what they did. We talked about the extensor digitorum, and you've got a flexor carpi ulnarius, tells you a little bit what bones are being caused to flex and where the muscle is originating from. So I just wanted you to see that there are many, many small muscles going down into these long tendons that will reach down into your fingers and enable you to move your fingers. Moving on down the body to the abdominal wall. This particular slide lost its lines when I brought it into this program. But the rectus abdominis are the muscles that are running straight up and down through the middle of your body. And of course, the name gives you some idea that they are involved in keeping you erect. Rectus abdominis muscles are, when they tense, they compress the contents of your abdomen, which increases the pressure inside there, which is important for expelling fecal matter and other activities. The external obliques are another set of muscles in your abdominal wall that you need to know, and they are the fibers of the muscles are running in the same direction that you put your hands into the pockets of your pants. So they are running in a downward slanted direction. They, like the rectus abdominis, are involved in providing support for the abdominal wall and compressing the contents when you're wanting to increase the pressure. There's a little transverse section here, just I included with this slide, just giving you an idea about the density of the muscles. In your abdominal wall, you've got several layers, and in all of the limbs and the parts of the body, you aren't just looking at one layer of muscle. There are over 600 different muscles in your body, so we've got layers on top of layers of muscles, enabling us to do the many precise movements that we can do. I'm only asking you to memorize 30. It's just sort of the superficial muscles, the ones that you might have some familiarity with already, that do some of the big movements. But there are many, many muscles that we're not going to talk about, and I just wanted to remind you that they are there. Now we're moving on to the muscles of the leg. We've got several big groupings in the leg. Down here we have the hamstring muscles. These are the muscles on the back of your leg. They're involved in flexing your knee, but of course your foot and your hand sort of point in different directions. When you flex your elbow, you bring your hand up towards your face, and when you flex your foot or flex your leg, you bring your foot up towards your back. So they're pointing in opposite directions. Like the biceps brachii in the front of your hand, front of the arm, you have the biceps femoris that are on the back of your leg in the hamstring group. The other hamstring muscle that I want you to remember is this semitendinosus, so a half tendon. I'm not sure where that name came from, but the semitendinosus and the biceps femoris are 2 out of the 3 parts of the hamstring group that I want you to remember. Along with flexing the lower leg, the hamstring also is involved in extending the thigh, the upper part of the leg, bringing it back towards 180 degrees. And the biceps femoris is also involved in rotating the leg laterally, turning it away from the midline. Then muscles that I think you're probably quite familiar with, the gluteus maximus and the gluteus minimus, as also in this posterior view. They perform important functions with your legs, extending your hip or your leg, again bringing it back to 180 when it has been flexed forward at the hip joint. The gluteus medius is also involved in rotating the hip, again because of the way it is where it is attached. It is able to rotate the thigh medially. So the hamstring rotates it laterally, and the gluteus medius brings the thigh back to the medial position. The 2 muscles, the gracilis and the sartorius, are coming all the way from the pelvic girdle down to the inserting on the lower leg. And so they are involved in moving the entire leg and rotating the entire leg. The gracilis is involved in adducting your thigh and flexing and rotating your lower leg medially. The sartorius is involved in abducting your thigh and rotating it laterally. So that because they are coming across 2 hip joints, they are able to make several different motions through that part of your body. The other muscle that is new on here is the gastrocnemius. That's your calf muscle. I'm sure you can picture that it's involved in raising your heel and causing plantar flexion to happen. And then we can just barely see over here the vastus lateralis, which is part of the quadriceps group, which we'll get to in the next slide. So moving to the looking at the rest of some of the muscles on your leg. The quadriceps, quad meaning four, there are four heads to the quadricep, and they all come down, so they originate four different places, but they all come down to attach into one common tendon that will go over the kneecap here, over the patella. The rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis are two of the parts that you need to remember. There's also a vastus medialis and a vastus intermedialis. So these are all part of the quadriceps, and they will be able to extend the knee, bring the knee joint from a flexed position back to a lateral position. The adductor longus, I think you can guess what that muscle does, and you can see it a little bit better in here. It's not a very long muscle compared to some of the other ones. But of course the name tells you that it's involved in adducting your leg, bringing it back to the medial position. And then we had talked already about the sartorius, mentioned it on the previous slide, and you can see how it attaches up here on the pelvic girdle and all the way down here. And it causes, because of that, it can bring abduction and rotation to the thigh. Looking at the lower leg, we talked about the gastrocnemius and how it's involved in plantar flexation. You see from this the attachment sites here for the hamstring, the biceps femoris, and the semitendinosus, and then the gracilis and the sartorius that we just mentioned coming down from the pelvic girdle. The gastrocnemius has two heads, and so this particular diagram shows you that, and it goes down into this big Achilles tendon that is so important and can be felt in the back of your foot. Two more muscles that are, or one more muscle that is new on this particular slide is the soleus. You can see it just kind of peeking around behind the Achilles tendon here. There's a little bit here, it's been the gastrocnemius muscle has been removed, so you're seeing in this particular diagram over here on the right, you're just seeing the soleus muscle, and it also is involved in plantar flexion. So there are often more than one muscle doing a particular movement. Some of that's sometimes involved on what position the rest of the bones are in. We think about the biceps as being the muscle that causes us to do curls, to flex the forearm up over the elbow. But that works when your palm is up, when it's in supination. But if you turn your hand so that your thumb and your radius is up, another muscle is the prime mover when it comes to flexion. And if you turn your hand palm down, again, another muscle is the prime mover. So the biceps is only the prime mover if you are flexing your arm with your palm up. So here we see the soleus and the gastrocnemius both involved in plantar flexion, but there are positions of the bones that would have one muscle activated more than another one. And then just a few more muscles. I think the only one that we have is the tibialis anterior here that you have to remember, and this is the muscle you can feel running right down the side of your shin. And so it is involved in dorsiflexion, pulling the top of the foot out, and inversion, turning your foot in. So those two particular foot movements, dorsiflexion and inversion, are handled by the tibialis anterior, this long muscle that is running right down the side of the shin. And you can see, I think, on this diagram down here on the bottom, you can see that the tendon actually sort of wraps around the bottom of your foot. And there's another muscle coming on the other side, the fibulalis muscle, that wraps around the other way, and it's these two tendons attaching on the bottom of your foot that contribute to the arch that you have on the bottom of your foot, which contributes to some shock absorption as you're walking. So that finishes the overview of muscles, muscle movement types, and the particular muscles that you need to memorize. There will be a quiz that will ask you to do a diagram, to identify these on a diagram, and we will practice that in class. And then you also need to identify what they do. So between this video and your notes for these learning targets, I'm sure you'll be able to put together some actions that go along with each of these muscles.